Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. You are now tuned into the program Making an Audience, Stories of Resistance and Transgression. With me is guest lecturer Pooyan Ruhi, an alumnus of Pratt Institute and SCI-Arc. He is an educator and editor. The focus of his work has been about histories and theories of education and radical architectural pedagogies. His presentation will delve into the work he has done in/for Iran in the past 10 years. His discussion partner is Iman Ansari, alumnus of UCLA and Harvard Graduate School of Design. He's an architectural historian, designer, and founding principal of Anonymous. This lecture will be followed by a discussion between the two about the role of books in the dissemination of discourse in contemporary architecture culture. We will have a Q&A section at the end of the discussion between two of them. Please hold all questions to be raised in the chat until that time. Please join me in welcoming our guests. Pooyan, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for the introduction. Thank you, Iman, for being here. I know you've had a long flight, and we appreciate your presence. This was my first book that I did almost 10 years ago. So this was mostly about SCI-Arc. 14 interviews with some of the faculty members at SCI-Arc, and Jeff Kipnis kindly wrote the introduction to this book. And this is my last book, titled Against Ideology, an Escape Plan for Architecture. So the secondary title is suggested by Iman, who kindly wrote the introduction to this book. So this is a number of texts that I've written over the years, and transcriptions of some of the events, some symposia or other public events that I organized over the years. So everything is revised and put together as a book. I'll go back to these books. So between the two books, there were mostly some editing work, translations, writings, some public events and lectures, a little bit of teaching, and a little bit of practice. And these all, in my mind, are part of the same project, and they run parallel to each other. So in the beginning that we were, in the early days that we were organizing for this event, it was supposed to be an in-person event. So, and it was supposed to happen at the library at SCI-Arc. So this is a plan of SCI-Arc, first floor, but I have located the library. It's the red circle on the right, and the blue circle on the left is where the shops are. So whether the result of an accident or not, this positioning of different parts of the school says something important about a school's attitude towards architecture. So on one side, you have conceptual knowledge, thinking, and on the other side, you have technical knowledge or making / building. So whatever happens, which is design studios, are in between. So the design aspect of architecture is supported by two very important ideas, conceptual and technical knowledge. We can see similar ideas in the history of architecture. So this is the title piece to Vignola's treatise. So the very fact that he's able to establish his character as an architect and look us in the eye is because he's being flanked or supported by two characters, being practice and theory. And this is something that did not exist, as you know, before the Renaissance. So I'll go back to this because it's important with respect to the context that I'm talking about. So when I started working on the first book, I have to give you some context as to what was happening in Iran at the time. And this is how I saw it at the time. So architecture education in Iran was and still is completely governmental. The curriculum is approved by and defined by the government. It is basically a worn-out Beaux-arts model of education. In every school, the word discipline did not exist, and this is very important. Everyone was talking about the profession. The word discipline did not exist, so the implications and connotations of the word also did not exist because the word itself did not exist. So other thing was that it was mostly a culture geared toward professional practice. So there was really no discourse, no conceptual slash theoretical discourse present. Architectural design in school meant and still mostly means Neufeld standards. And I hope you're familiar with Neufeld standards. It's a book of mostly measurements, standard measurements. There was no distinction between architecture and building. There existed an antagonistic attitude toward form. Experimentation, criticality, and speculation were and are heavily suppressed. The word imagination is almost never used. Phenomenology, contextualism, and environmental design are popular. And for the most part, a sociocentric tendency is present. And I will talk about these. So this is Tehran. If you are located around the center of the city towards the north and look toward the north, this is what you will see. It's interesting because when Peter Trummer came to Iran, he said Tehran is probably one of the very few cities in the world in which you can experience the 70s. And he was basically talking about the urban condition of Tehran, high-rises and so on and so forth. It's interesting because if we look at this architectural phenomenology, contextualism, and environmental design are basically movements or attitudes that are rooted in the 70s, late 60s and 70s. So to me, it seemed like the physical context of the city or the country and the conceptual mentality are in a way linked together. This is an example of the well, in a way, sociocentric tendency that I talked about. So this is a quote by a former Minister of Cultural Heritage. So this is, in a way, the official position of the government or the educational institutions towards tradition, towards creativity. So as you can see, he would say something like this: there is only one relation you can have with tradition. You must sit quietly and politely in front of it in silence and learn. So there is no discussion of questioning. There is no discussion of critical thinking. There's only a discussion of sitting quietly and politely in silence and learning. So I think what was happening and is happening in Iran could be defined basically with the term massification. And I would oppose education and massification. Massification is a term that I'm getting from Paulo Freire, who you know, Brazilian philosopher and pedagogue. And he talks about how massification, in a way, is an education that is geared toward training a mass that is uncritical, basically, does not question, only follows. So this is a book, this is a work of fiction by Julian Barnes, the fiction writer, The Noise of Time, which is about the life of Dmitri Shostakovich, the Russian composer, mid-century, 20th century Russian composer. And it's really interesting because when you read the book, it's amazing how similar ideas that existed during the time of Stalin in a different form still exist in Iran, the attitude towards form or formalism. And this is really important because Shostakovich was this close to being sent to the Gulag, basically to be executed, because he was accused of being a formalist. So it was a culture very much antagonistic towards formalism. In Iran, obviously, you won't be sent to the Gulag or something like that, but it's the official attitude towards form and formalism is defined in a way that it's frowned upon. It's not encouraged. So if you're accused of being a formalist, basically you're accused of being superficial. So something that you're all familiar with is the transformation of architecture over the course of history. So you know that in the ancient world, architecture was its technique, and then it turned into a craft during the Middle Ages, and then it turned into basically an intellectual discourse or art of disegno with the work of Alberti. And then during the 17th century in France, it became a fine art. And then 19th century, it became a profession and also discipline, meaning the first institutional programs for educating architects were established in universities in the UK and the United States. And eventually, one could argue that after 1960s, again, architecture got some power as a form of intellectual discourse. So this was not experienced in the East. Iran did not go through these stages. And this is something that you can see, you can read in this very interesting, fascinating work of scholarship for historical definitions of architecture by Stephen Parcell. Since this is a lecture about books, I'll be showing you a number of books, and this is one of them. So in Iran, architecture was a craft until 1940, and after that, it suddenly became a fine art. So there was no transformation or basically what happened in the West did not happen in Iran. So this is King Reza, father of the Shah, last king of Iran. So he was very much interested in modernizing Iran based on what he saw in Turkey with Ataturk. So this is the University of Tehran. He was an uneducated person, but he had intellectuals and educated people as his advisors or secretaries. So he knew very well that a modernized society needs modern institutions. And one of them, obviously, is universities. So Tehran University was the first one that he ordered to be designed and built by French architects. So Andre Godard was a graduate of the Beaux-arts, architect and archaeologist. So he was in charge of designing basically the university with a number of other colleagues. And also he helped come up with the basically curriculum of the first modern architecture program in the University of Tehran. So this was basically, obviously, because he was a graduate of the Beaux-arts, he used that same model to define the model of education that was used in the University of Tehran. So the king also wanted to have basically modern buildings. So in the beginning of his monarchy, it was all about reviving the grandeur and magnificence of the Persian Empire. So he had the French architects look at Persepolis, for example, and do this, which is the main police station today is the Secretary of State in Tehran. But gradually, looking at something like this and then coming up with this, which is a museum in Tehran, Gradually, the agenda changed. So when we get to this, for example, it's really not about reviving the ancient magnificence. It's about something else. So it's the first attempt at coming up with a modern sensibility within the buildings. So during the 40s through all the way to the 70s, which is basically the era of Shah, his son, things that were a little bit different. So this is a work by an architect named Gabriel Gebrekian. And this is important because he was part of the modern discourse. He was friends with Mies and Corbusier, and he was part of the Werkbund exhibitions in Vienna. And this is a project that he designed. And he came back to Iran and started designing and making buildings. So this is the kind of typical modern architecture during the time of Shah, which basically was being produced during 40s and 50s, 60s, and early 70s. So it wasn't about looking at an image and trying to copy that. Gabriel Gebrekian was actually part of the discourse, and he and a number of other architects, mostly graduated outside Iran, were basically involved with the project of modernization in Iran. During the late 60s and 70s, we have the international style, and you can see an example of that here. So it was all about international style, glass skyscrapers, and so on and so forth. Already in the mid 70s, there's a discussion of identity. So the architect Kamran Diba, who was a cousin to the queen, argued for a need for a contemporary museum, and he was in charge of acquiring works of art. So still today, Contemporary Museum of Tehran holds one of the probably the largest and most important basically collection of modern works of art, paintings and sculpture. So this is his own design. So he's looking at the Iranian vernacular architecture and trying to, in a way, redefine that in a new modern form language. So another interesting thing that happened in Iran was International Congress of Architecture. So there was two of them, and it seemed that Iranian architects tried to make the king interested, the Shah, in inviting well-known architects, international architects to Iran, Kenzo Tange, Angers, Jose Luis Sert, and many more, to come to Iran and basically help define projects. And for not much scholarship have been done on this events or period in a way, but for some reason the Shah did not become interested, and this did not amount to anything significant. And James Sterling has a short piece. This is really interesting. Probably I won't go through the details, but if you're able to find it, which you will be if you look it up, it's really interesting how he looks at Iran's agenda for basically going through modernism, and he's arguing that we've done that, we've been there, it's not going to work, you shouldn't do it. It's really interesting. So during the 1980s, things were different because of the revolution and because of the war, Iran was in a way completely isolated. So one could imagine that some books and magazines would enter Iran and architects would look at them and try to, following the cue of historicist postmodernism, in a way replicate things like that. And this is an example of that. And this is another example. So the architect here is basically looking at the vernacular architecture of Iran, using classical principles to, in a way, create something new. But if you look at the organization of the plan, it's completely a classical project. It's completely symmetrical, completely hierarchical, based on the classical tenets and principles, and basically with a postmodernist attitude or rhetoric. This is another example. So it's kind of an austere building, but you can see that it follows the same principles: classical hierarchy, repetition of elements. So it's looks modern, but basically it's not based on modern principles. It's a classical building in the form or formal language of modern architecture. So during the 90s, something very important happens, and that's basically Bahram Shirdal decides to go from the Architectural Association, and he was at the time the director of the graduate program, established the program with the help of Jeff Gitness. But then because of a project at Tehran International Airport, he decides to leave that and go to Iran. And I think this is an important moment. Might sound like a bold statement, but I think architecture in post-revolutionary Iran, at least, starts with Bahram Shirdal for the very simple fact that he was the first disciplinary theory-informed architectural practice. This is a project that he did for the airport. And it's interesting because the government wanted him to design an airport for the year 2020, which can provide service for 5 million people. And he did the studies and he said, that's not going to work. For 2020, you need an airport that supports 40 million people. And he was right, but the government said, no, do what we want. We don't want you to do something else. And they did not listen to them. He did not listen to them. He designed an airport for 40 million people. But then, unfortunately, they decided to go ahead and do something else, which I'll show you in a minute. But before that, the project that they did for Tehran basically came out of studios that he taught at Harvard University and later Architectural Association. And this is the project for Spreebogen. This was a project for moving the capital in Germany to Berlin. So this is basically a project based on ideas, Deleuzian ideas. So everything is connected and everything is in a way striated. So this was the foundation of this project. The airport basically comes from what he did with his students in these two studios. And unfortunately, this is a project that was done for 40 million, for 4 million people, and it's completely inefficient, doesn't work, doesn't have any basically significant architectural ideas. So not only he brought with himself a new discourse, but also he was influential in transforming other architects' work. So this is something that an architect was doing, Hadi Mehran was doing before Bahram Shirdal going to Iran. They formed a partnership and then they do this together. And then later Mehran does this. So he completely transforms into a different architect because of Bahram's presence. So after 2000s, I'm just going to show you a number of projects that show that there is an interest in a way, the use of new materiality, or in a way, basically designing what we call nice buildings, but they do not necessarily, they are not necessarily theory informed. They're not consciously engaging the discourse. They are mostly, I would say, trying to be interesting or having a high quality or be nice, as one could describe. So I would argue that most of them are based on the model of the decorated shed. So they're trying to come up with interesting ways of, in a way, coming up with a facade, so to speak. But there are some exceptions as well. And this is one of them by Ali Reza. This is a conscious attempt at looking at established traditions of architecture and, in a way, questioning them. So this is a project in which these boxes rotate, and by their rotation, they create different conditions, different sectional conditions, and different programmatic conditions. And this is something that Ali Reza also tries to do in other projects as well. So this is a project which is a hybrid condition between a modern grid and Iranian vernacular vault system. So he's trying to put them together and see what he can do. It's a conscious questioning of, in a way, spatial organizational strategies. Or this one, which is one of my favorites, this is an office building in which the architect, fluid motion architects, play with the idea of the domino diagram and sectional object. So you can see it's based on the, mostly based on the domino diagram, but at the same time, sectional pockets have been inserted into, in a way, the kind of generic plan and try to establish new relationships between them. This is another project by the same architects. It's a cinema complex. So besides the new relationship of the figure ground, besides the new relationship that the architects create regarding the idea of the figure ground, they also look at the idea of spatial organization. They look at the idea of sectional objects, and this is basically, these are the two ideas that are being introduced within this project, the figure ground and the sectional object. This is a very important project, I think, and extremely controversial. So this is a mosque. So, and this is the old theater hall of Tehran. So there was a lot of discussions of this building being acontextual. So the critics would say this building does not look like a mosque, so it's a bad mosque. Or they would say this building is ugly, so it's a bad mosque. Or they would say it doesn't respect the theater, so it's a bad mosque. Or they would say it doesn't respect the context. It's like, it looks like something alien, so it's a bad mosque. So I think all those arguments are problematic because of obvious reasons. I think one thing that this mosque does is that the new relationship between the ground that is defined here, that it defines, because usually you cannot go on the ceiling of the mosque because it's considered a sacred place, but the architects turn the ceiling to the ground, and they establish a different relationship, a new relationship that did not exist with the city, with the urban, basically fabric of the city. Another thing is that they are questioning what the mosque should look like, because almost every mosque has a dome and has minarets. So in this mosque, the architect said, we're not going to do that. We're going to question the idea of a dome and the necessity for minarets being present. So this was to give you a little bit of context, and this is where I started my work. So I thought I have to look for architects who have been in the similar situations over the history of architecture. So the first one that comes to mind was Alberti, because he's the first one that defines the character of architect as an intellectual person that is different from a master mason, a person who should be present on a construction site. An architect in the mind of Alberti is an intellectual who comes up with ideas and draws them. So this was an anomaly within the culture of late medieval times and early Renaissance. The second person was Philibert Delorme, very interesting character, 16th century France, and he faced a similar situation. And in the beginning of his treatise, he differentiates between the character of architect and people who wear the mask of architects, aka master masons. And obviously, Peter Eisenman, who I would say, as he talks about this, he also faced similar situations, because in the late 50s, early 60s, when he started what he was doing, he basically was immersed in a culture of professional, in a way, building making. That was a little bit different from a culture that we have today. So I looked at these people, and there was something common among all of them, and it was a serious dedication to books, to writing, to making books. So I thought I would start by differentiating in my writings, differentiating between architecture and building, because until then, it was considered the same thing. Architecture was building and building was architecture. But I started talking about how really architecture is not building. We can differentiate, we can have a spectrum in which we can situate different works of architecture or different buildings based on their the ideas present in them, basically. Everyone in Iran was talking about how people need architecture and how architects should address what people need and what people want. So I thought this is a very good example, because in Maslow's pyramid, we can see that there is no architecture. Nobody needs architecture. And this is something that Bahram Shirdo also talks about. No one needs architecture, because architecture is not a product of need. It's an object of desire. So as you can see in the first tier, everyone needs shelter, but one could argue that architecture is not shelter. Architecture is something else. And things like these qualities that Jeff Kipnis talks about, that every person who wants to buy a house, or every client who wants to have a building built, want for their projects, but Jeff argues that really none of these relate to architecture. None of these are important for us because of obvious reasons. Because, for example, all of these values could be found in something like this, and we can agree that this is not a work of architecture. This is just a generic building. When a generic building like this has all these qualities, then the question becomes, what is the role of architecture if a generic building could provide all these basically qualities? I also looked at other sources, for example, Bernard's differentiation between architecture and building. He uses Pevsner's famous quote that a bicycle shed is a building and a cathedral is architecture, and he reverses that. And he basically argues that architecture is about ideas. So I had to show what I meant by ideas. So Peter Trommer's drawings with respect to the idea of figure ground were extremely helpful. And this is something that I've been teaching in my history theory classes and also design workshops since early on. I also looked at Andrew Zago's diagram of the profession and the discipline and tweaked it a little bit based on Clement Greenberg's idea of the avant-garde and also Bernard Chimy's writings that are titled Architecture and Limits. So I use this as a critical device to differentiate between generic and non-generic building and architecture, and conservative and speculative, and also used it to situate different buildings based on their relevance to the ideas, to the discipline of architecture, basically situate them within different areas in the circle, in and around the circle. So I'm going to show you a number of books that I've done and I think are important to me at least. This is Paperless Studio and Columbia under Bernard Chimy. This was the result of a study that I did while studying in the design theory and pedagogy program at SCI-Arc back in 2016. And this was done under Todd Gannon, who has been extremely generous always and supportive. So this is a study that I started under Todd, and I continued, and I did a series of interviews with some of the original Paperless Studio instructors and some of the graduates of Columbia of the 90s who are respected educators and architects today, Hernan, Ed Keller, Marcel Ingau, and so on and so forth. So this basically is an oral history. I'm not a historian, unfortunately, but this was an attempt at basically creating a kind of an oral history. This is a book about Peter Eisenman, so it's some of his most important notes, interviews, and debates that I put together and translated. This is a book, Architecture and Object-Oriented Ontology. Graham Harman kindly wrote the introduction, and he's amazing. He's always been generous and nice, and I've learned a lot from him. So this was a privilege to have him write the introduction for this book. And this is the domain of paint, the work of Elena Manfredini. Elena has been extremely generous and supportive over the years, and this was really a fun book to do. I think Elena's work is really important because it makes you look at things differently, and I think every creative person who makes you look at things differently is a significant character, and Elena is one. So this is an unpublished book. This is a series of interviews that I did with Bahram Shirdel. This is his dissertation, Country of Spectators, at Cranbrook. He was a student under Daniel Libeskind, a very significant moment, late 70s, early 80s in Detroit. So this is a book that I'm really happy about, and I'm waiting for an opportunity to publish it. And you know, this project, NARA, this was among the top finalist projects that were shown later at the MoMA in New York City. There was a moment in my work that I thought it's really important to do foundational work. And I decided with Mehrnaz, a dear friend and colleague, to start working for children. And this is a book that is basically about creativity and critical thinking and architecture. So we did this one, which is an interesting book, very informative. And these two were done for children, and we have some other books for children on the way, but I'm not going to talk about them. So I have other writings as well. So I use other, in a way, mediums, websites to in a way, disseminate what I wanted to say or do in a sense. So this is an example of that. This is something that I wrote about in an elementary school, and it's a really interesting project. Everyone who talked about this talked about how this project is contextual because of the materiality which fits the surrounding. But to me, that was not interesting. To me, what was interesting was that this was basically, I tried to offer a formal reading of the project, and no one really does that. The readings are basically in Iran are either phenomenological or from the point of view of the relationship established with the context. So I looked at the work of people like Witzkauer, Collingbourg, and Jacqueline Gardas, mostly. And I argued that, well, here we have a center and we have a periphery, and these two are creating differentiation on a landscape which is otherwise undifferentiated. And we have concentric circles that define different spatial, in a way, priorities. And we have two circles that are intersecting and creating a poche. And poche was something, also another term that did not exist in Iran. So I had to introduce it. I had to find a way to translate it. We talked about how the architects are trying to activate the poche. It's not just a poche. It's not black, in a way, solid, but it's activated through the use of programs. I talked about how this project has two different axes of entrance rather than one axis, which is hierarchical and classical, and so on and so forth. So a little bit of teaching. My first workshop was called Computation and Fabrication. And the reason was that I wrote a piece and I argued that we need to rethink our infrastructure within the universities. We need to have, one thing I should mention is that architectural libraries in Iran are basically filled with coffee table books. They're not really theory, history books in them in the universities. So I argue that we need to have history theory books in libraries, but also we need to have fabrication labs. We need to have CNC machines and 3D printers. And immediately there was a very strong negative reaction. So I thought, okay, I talked about it. So maybe if I do it, things would be different. So this was basically the first time that something of this kind was done, a design workshop that tries to take advantage of fabrication technology. And the technology was, in a way, already present. Architects were not using it. Other people, furniture makers were using it, but we started to outsource it. So this is another project. This is one of the final projects that was designed and done. And this is another one. So we had two benches, and in the background, you can see that we had other things as well to play and experiment with CNC, in a way, potentials. This was a workshop that I did in 2018. So I have to emphasize that these were, in the beginning especially, these were done mostly for the students that did not even know how to work with Rhino. Over the years, gradually, the number of people who had worked with Rhino increased, but in the beginning, even, I would say 9 out of 10 even did not know how to work with Rhino. So we had to introduce them to Rhino, we had to introduce them to ZBrush, and this is the result of that. This is a workshop in which we worked with abstract geometrical patterns that we, in a way, extracted from Persian Persian rugs, Persian carpets. This was, I would say, a good experience for me, because it was my first time also teaching. So to me, also things were newly developing syllabi and so on and so forth. This is another workshop in which we work with Iranian vernacular architecture, and we experimented with different techniques of, in a way, creating geometry. This is the result of that. This is other projects. All of these are extracted from bits and pieces of vernacular architecture, Iranian vernacular architecture. So this was another workshop, similar ideas, different techniques. This one too. In this one, we looked at the work of Christy Ballier and other architects who've done the book Possible Medians. We try to tweak it a little bit. We try to always, I think it's important to always try to push it a little bit and see if we can come up with something different. So again, this was based on Iranian vernacular and traditional architecture, using different techniques and ideas. So there were two projects that I wanted to show you that I helped in a way define for Iran. I'm going to talk about one of them. And this is an office building that is designed by Zago Architecture. And it was a privilege to work for Andrew Zago. He's an amazing teacher, terrific architect. And I learned from him that an architect needs to be extremely patient, extremely dedicated, and extremely meticulous. So it was a great experience, and it's being built right now, which I'm really happy about. So I thought books are really good, events are really good, but what if we do projects very well? Because projects bring with themselves discourse. So this is one of those two projects that basically we did, and I'm hoping we will do more projects by international architects in Iran in the future. I did a number of public events too. So I organized, basically, I was the director of a summer program. I put together a number of colleagues and friends who were educated outside Iran. And I asked them to teach a syllabus of their own writing. And along the classes, we also had a lecture series. And I tried to put together a list of people who I thought were important. And you can see Iman is here present, Pamela Karami, very respected scholar present, Parsa Khalidi, who teaches at Princeton, another Tehrani. So this was an attempt at basically looking at what a person at this level has to say that could be used in Iran by Iranian architects and students. So basically, being exposed to bits and pieces of contemporary discourse and contemporary works of scholarship, because each person on this list has a different area of focus and work. This is an event that I'm really happy about. I helped co-organize with the second person from left, Kuman, who is a graduate of Architectural Association. The person on the left is Reza, the architect, one of the architects of the fluid motion architects who were responsible for the design of the mosque that I showed you earlier. And the person on the right is Ali Reza with the moving boxes project. And the other person, second from right, is Mr. Asghar Farhadi, 2 times Oscar winner film director. And this was an interesting event because I saw a number of drawings that students were making in a class in Contemporary Architecture Association, a place that I teach at in Iran, which were based on one of the films done by Mr. Farhadi. So one of my friends was a student of Mr. Farhadi. So I thought maybe we could put together a jury, basically, session that is comprised of architects and filmmakers and talked about these drawings. But then the idea got bigger and bigger, and it turned into a public event, which was an exhibition, which you can see here, a panel discussion that you saw here about architecture and film, and also a series of lectures. And you can see me over there talking about Shining and Jeff Kipnis's ideas of interstitial spaces and things going wrong when people go to the places that they don't belong to. So this was an interesting event that I'm really happy that I got to do it or help do it. So this is the last slide. This is a scene in the movie Alphaville by the French New Wave filmmaker Jean-Luc Godard. And this is really important. So to give you a little context, the protagonist, the gentleman, goes to this dystopian city called Alphaville, in which there's only one book. Everything else is forbidden. And the lady tells him that this is the Bible. And the protagonist picks up the book and sees that it's not a Bible, it's a dictionary. And then the lady explains that every year some words become forbidden. We're not allowed to use them. And later in another scene, we find out that why is one of those words. No one can say why. It's a forbidden word. And to my mind, for the most part, the architecture scene in Iran, at least the official architecture scene or the official attitude toward architecture education, is a similar dystopian condition in which you cannot ask why. So if I like to look at what I've done over the years in this way. I like to think that I've been only encouraging students and young architects to be, in a way, brave and ask why. Basically, that's how I would frame it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pooyan, for this really fascinating lecture and such diverse set of works. I think I would like to go back to the discussion of the book in architecture, and maybe to give a little bit of a mini introduction to our conversation. Want to go back to something that you and I have exchanged before. And that comes from the second chapter of Victor Hugo's novel, the Notre Dame de Paris, published in 1831, and the scene where the chapter where the antagonist, Claude Frollo, directs the eyes of the two visitors from the printed book on his desk to the large silhouette of the cathedral beyond, and announces that this will kill that. And that phrase in Hugo's thesis really encapsulates his position about architecture. For him, the history of architecture is really entangled with the history of writing. And buildings functioned before the 15th century as the primary medium of communication. Hugo himself wrote, "Whoever was born a poet became an architect." And in an era when books were written by hand, and were heavily censored and chained to the shelves of these private libraries, the privilege and the freedom of inscribing thought in stone was only reserved for architecture. From Stonehenge to the Parthenon, texts were inscribed in books of stone. And architecture for Hugo was really the embodiment of knowledge. But everything suddenly changed, as he said, in the 15th century with the invention of the printing press, which he considered the greatest event in history. And the print culture facilitated the communication and dissemination of ideas, which he correctly distinguished it from as a new medium, and even a simpler and more lasting than architecture. All right, in his view, architecture was dethroned, and the lead characters of Gutenberg succeeded the stone characters of Orpheus. And that's how he concluded, really, that the book was to kill the building. And as you pointed out in your lecture, we now know that the rise of the print culture, as it turned out, did not really kill architecture, as his protagonist in his story had predicted, but really became instrumental in the formation of a discipline and discourse of architecture during the Renaissance. The reappearance of Vitruvius's book, along with the mechanical reproduction of text drawings, allowed architects from Alberti to Serlio, Palladio, Scimoti to not only produce buildings, but also treatises and books. But what made the mass production of inscriptions really instrumental in this period was the formation of an architectural discipline concept that you specifically highlighted. And the books were not really self-promotional, but mostly about, or not only self-promotional, but also about the dissemination of ideas, discussion and a dialogue that became the key ingredients of that discourse in architecture. And as we look at our modern era, we see that this tradition has sustained us. Architects today not only just make objects or buildings, even drawings, but also produce texts, syllabi, like you showed your teachings, lectures, exhibitions, events. Buildings have also lost their aura, it seems, or their position as the primary instrument for the production or communication of architectural knowledge. And in some ways, architecture has really fully evolved into an active discipline that no longer only relies on passive means of construction or what you described as craft, but also on an active discussion, a debate, and a discourse of ideas through written language. And as I listened to your lecture, I kept thinking that perhaps this is really what Hugo meant by the idea of this will kill that. But yet today, 5 centuries later, since the invention of the print, and where it seems like we're in the midst of yet another historical transformation, another paradigm shift that has once again changed everything. And more specifically, I'm talking about the emergence of the digital culture, and that has practically transformed every aspect of our lives. And I want to maybe begin by asking you what you see the place of printed books in the culture we live in today, in the digital culture, and to really put it simply, why is the book still relevant in this culture and in this discipline?
Thank you. That's a great question. I don't know if I have a good answer to that. I would say one aspect of books is that I'm not sure, are you referring to physical books, or are you talking about books in any format? So if you please clarify that.
Well, I think from what I understand, and you can correct me, that the books that you have been engaged with and produced have mostly been in a physical printed format. And there is, I think, as architects, I tend to think about it a lot because we love books. But also, I feel like as architects, we collect more books than we read them. There's something about books and the idea that even in every practice seems to enter the field through a publication of a monograph or a book. And in most cases, those are primarily conceived as printed books, as objects. And I'm wondering, for you, where do you see that, and how do you see the role of the printed book in today's culture? Is it still as potent, as relevant? Does it require a transformation? And even specifically in the context of Iran, I think I'm curious to know what you saw as the importance of producing books.
Yeah, that's a great question. It reminded me that I intended to include an image in the presentation, and I forgot. And it was an image of an installation named "The Power of One Book," and this is a very, very famous viral image. I'm sure you all might have seen it. It's a brick wall, and underneath the wall, on the first basically row of bricks, there's a book. And because of the differentiation and the size and shape, it transforms the whole wall. So it's like a disruption within the fabric of the wall. So that's how I would look at it. I think in Iran, I can speak a little bit more confidently about Iran. I think one could argue that it's a nostalgic idea regarding having the physical books in your hand. It might be true, but I think it's also a generational thing. So I would say the new generation, Generation Z, and so on and so forth, it's been discussed that it has a lower, or I would say smaller, attention span, right? So whatever fits on the screen of a tablet or a phone, a smartphone phone, is more welcome than something that is long and in a way tedious to read, right? So to me, personally, I would rather to have a physical book in my hands, maybe because I belong to a different generation. But obviously, it doesn't matter what the format is, as long as the knowledge exists. The problem in Iran is that the knowledge does not exist, and in no format. So the books that we do, we also have a digital format for almost all of them. So whoever does not want to purchase the physical book for any reason, including the price, they can go on a website and have the digital version of the book at a less expensive price. So I think that's that. That being said, I think to me, what was important was, and that's why I didn't have any, although I was very much interested in books and making them, but I also used other formats for dissemination of ideas, websites or panel discussions, right, that have not been turned into words or published physically. So I think that's really important because in Iran, it was a habit of having opinions, random opinions that are not substantiated by evidence, by knowledge. So I thought that it's important to break that, or at least try to show or argue that you cannot have random opinions. You need to base your statements on something. And this is really interesting and scary. Let me tell you about this event. The very first jury session that I was invited in Iran, I went there, and before the beginning, the educator in charge welcomed everyone and said, please forget all the books that you've read before making any judgments of the works. And I was like, I can't do that, because if I forget the books that I've read, then I wouldn't have anything to say. Obviously, I don't want to replicate or copy word for word what I've read, but these books, these knowledge is the foundation of what I'm going to say to you. Without that, I cannot basically make any comments. Mm-hmm. So that's why I think books in a way are really important for Iran today. I don't know if that.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Thank you. And given that, just want to our audience here, given that we have a hard stop at 6:45, as I continue this, I have one more question for Pooyan, but I invite you, if you have any questions for him, to use the chat to write it, and I'll try to bring it up. Pooyan, I have one more question. I think you did a good job providing the context, the intellectual context of architecture in Iran, and the need, as you argue, to lay the groundwork for a new sort of disciplinary sort of a discourse in architecture. But I also now want to kind of turn it around. I mean, to argue that you've done a lot of work over the past 10 years in teaching, in publishing, in books, in practice, in engaging with events, and mostly in introducing the sort of canonical Western texts and contemporary discussions to the Iranian architectural scene, and that also instigated renewed interest in discussion around these ideas. But in some ways, if you think about it, here in the West, we're dealing also with a problem. The Western canon itself has been under let's say question, and there have been attempts, especially more so in recent years, to what many have called to decolonize the discourse of architecture in the West. So I'm wondering, as someone who has attempted to bridge that cultural divide in some ways so far, in the benefit of conveying and carrying those ideas from West to the East, do you have any plans perhaps to do the opposite? Maybe, for example, translates some of the canonical Iranian texts that you think are important into English, or to introduce those practices to the Western audience?
Thank you. That's a great question. I have to say that I haven't done this on my own. I have great, in a way, patrons. For example, my publisher, who are a couple, very nice couple, architects, scholars, and have been extremely supportive. My amazing assistant instructors, who some of them are here, so she's here today. Without them, I was not able to do what I've been doing. And it's not just me. I think there's a new generation of people like me, you, who are graduate Graduated mostly outside Iran. I can see that Ariane is here. I don't know Ariane personally, but I've been informed of the amazing work he's been doing, organizing lectures for Harvard educators and teachers. So it's not just me. I think it's a generational phenomena, and I'm really happy about it because it's not something that one person can do. It's really a collective effort, and I'm really happy that I see all these new students of mine going to great schools around the world, or people like Ariane doing the work that it's doing, or people like you. So I think things are changing, and there's hope for the future of Iran. In terms of the way I look at things, it's interesting because I really like Edward Said's ideas of Orientalism. I think when I look at the West, I look at the West through the lens of an Eastern person. And when I look back at Iran, I look at Iran from the lens of a Western person. So these two dimensions of my identity as an immigrant are in a way cooperating with each other. Sometimes one is dominant, sometimes the other. And it helps me a lot because Said's ideas are basically about how changing the worldview or changing the point of view can help us understand the things that we cannot understand otherwise. So looking at West through the lens of an Iranian has helped me a lot, and vice versa. So that's that. About Iranian text, unfortunately, I don't think there is anything significant relating to contemporary times. I would say, as you know better than I do, because you're a historian, you're a scholar, and I'm not, unfortunately, yet. There are not that many texts discovered that belong to the old times. I would say the time that I would say Safavid period, for example. I'm sure there are some, but they're not widely known or maybe discovered. I was reading the other day that there's some books that are called, I don't know how to translate it, it's called Fotobatname, in a way, the book of chivalry, maybe. It could be translated into the book of chivalry, or the book of being a gentleman, something like that, that are about basically work ethics in building making or architecture. I haven't read them, I haven't found them anywhere, but I was reading that there exists, some of them exist today. So it will be interesting to see what they have to offer, because really we don't know much about the processes of old practices. We're not sure how the architects during the Safavid time designed and worked. We had some vague ideas. Yes, they built models. Yes, they did one-to-one drawings on the ground, and then they translate them to the building. But really, nothing concrete is available. So if something becomes available, I would be happy to take a look at it and see what we can do.